I do think the new administration has, to some extent, taken advantage of the fact that the country is quite divided. News media are not entirely trusted, at least as in terms of the institution of the press. At the same time, people tend to trust whatever outlet they consume. There, as you referenced, there are also long-term trends in terms of lack of trust in the United States press, and those could be accelerated and made worse, or they could be made better. And I don't think it's inevitable either way. I think some of this is being worked out in the initial months, and in the 1970s, the press was held in quite high regard after Watergate, which is the scandal that brought down President Richard Nixon, and the approval ratings for U.S. journalism were quite high. It was like in the 60s and 70% range. It is entirely possible, I don't believe anything is inevitable, that U.S. journalists could play a very active and engaged role in holding the administration to account and could gain back some of their credibility. Or it could be the case that the news media continues to face problems in terms of confidence and continues to be quite under fire from the administration. So I'm not sure either's inevitable, but I do think the next year is going to be quite chaotic as the administration tries to figure out how it wants to handle the news media. It is worth remembering that Donald Trump was one of the best and most engaged political candidates ever in terms of, in his early candidacy, engaging with journalists constantly, calling up talk shows, doing interviews. He was very open. People had his cell phone number. People were calling him. He would call them back. He was actually rather wonderful in terms of being very open and direct with the press. And that's changed as he's realized that there are different. It's a different dynamic once you become a nominee and then a president. But I hope over time that he'll realize that the press is very important in the society, that as interpreters of what's important and what's true, and that a different relationship will ultimately take hold. So I do think subscriptions, increasingly people who think about news and who are news media executives are starting to embrace this idea that perhaps subscriptions actually are a path forward, or at least a piece of that sustainable model that we've all been searching for. I'm not sure anyone thinks it's the silver bullet. At the same time, because subscriptions provide a good deal of revenue, but they don't provide sufficient revenue to have the size of the newsroom that, for example, the New York Times, had. So I think people are increasingly persuaded that it's going to be a hybrid model where the advertising money is reduced compared to historic highs, as we were discussing earlier. And you asked about a third way. So there actually may be a third and fourth and fifth way. So, and that may be, there's a combination of subscriptions, there's with advertisements, with other kinds of, for example, sponsorship of events, other forms of revenue. You can think about revenue diversity almost, right? There used to be just one or two basic streams, advertising being the big one, subscription being kind of second. Maybe there are other kinds of revenue streams, albeit small in many cases, and many news organizations are starting to do this, Then there's the whole question of branded content and native advertising, which falls into advertising but is a kind of new thing. And it's been quite successful for some news outlets. I probably think that over time, the prevailing idea of revenue diversity is going to be crucial in terms of finding sustainable business models, and that there won't be, as in the past, a sort of single revenue stream that will sustain news organizations. So there is a great deal of public data available to U.S. Journalists, and much of it's made public on websites, on government websites. At the same time, there's a lot of data and a lot of records that have to be requested by journalists. And we, I think, are fortunate in that in 1966, Congress passed and the president signed something called the Freedom of Information Act, which is a very robust set of rules which says that except in a few special cases, national security, personnel, and sort of litigation those are the exceptions. But for the most part, almost anything is theoretically requestable by journalists, and that has been of huge benefit, I think, to society. That transparency by stipulated by rule of law. I think the government should do more. I mean, as with most government websites, they're not as good as they could be. The Obama administration made great progress on a number of fronts. So they had a number of data efforts encapsulated by the website data.gov, which tried to centralize all of the big data that the government was producing.